Thanks for sharing, everybody. And so you've covered a lot of the Florida impacts. I'll just go over a couple. Sea level change, sea level rise. This is a map projection for Florida in 2021, and you can see like, big population centers like Miami, Fort Lauderdale being really dramatically impacted by sea level change, Key West as well. So that's a big issue to think about with regard to the future of these cities. More immediately, we just have, you have experienced more danger days. So that's where the heat index is above 105. And you can see that that trend is expected to continue into the future. Actually, these are all future projections. This little map here is based on some of that data that we've been collecting. This is the one that I hate the most. Mosquito season growing. So it used to be only about 317 days of bad mosquitoes, and now it's up to 337. And so that is a significant problem, as I mentioned, for those vector-borne diseases. Urban heat. This map is for Miami, which even though there is a bit of a positive correlation demonstrated by this line, meaning like you have more problems with ozone as the temperature increases. Miami's pretty good. Arizona's line is a little, or Phoenix's line is like a little bit sharper. So it has more problems with ozone and particle pollution, et cetera, with higher temps. So, even though you'll definitely be subject to worse air quality, not as bad as in some other cities. Heavy participation. So this has changed a bit. And has gotten worse over the past few decades, particularly when we're talking about rain of 3 inches or more. Before we go on to impacts of food, I do want to show you where I got this data from. And I'm going to share my screen. And I know this is obnoxious to move between screens, but this site is really, really great. I'll put it in the chat in a minute. It's called States at Risk. It's from Climate Central. And not only can you click on this awesome map to find out if your state is at risk, when you do click on the map, it shows you just a series of different topics that are related to climate change in your state, and gives you a very, very, very detailed look at what's happening in your neck of the woods. And so if you click on each of these, it builds out to a bigger article where you can get much more information about, oops, mine's not working, where you can get much more information about how Florida is experiencing these climate-related issues. Not sure why mine's not working, but so that's where most of these graphics in the presentation came from. And that information is derived from all kinds of different scientific websites that have been studying climate change for the past few decades. So let's talk about food. How has climate change impacted food? So the first is that there are global level research to demonstrate that food and land use, so changing land from natural ecosystems to farmland, are huge sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the UN estimates 23% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture and livestock and the land and forests needed to raise them. So when you have a natural ecosystem that is growing trees and plant communities and housing animals and bacteria and fungi, that system is actually sequestering carbon. It's taking carbon out of the air and using it primarily to build the bodies of plants. And then when animals eat plants, it builds their bodies too. And when those organisms die in natural environments, most of that carbon gets trapped underground or is used by other organisms. So it's taken out of the atmosphere and embedded in that system and doesn't escape. And when you clear those areas, oftentimes that means burning the trees and other plants in that community, that releases that atmosphere into the, releases that carbon into the atmosphere. So another reason to think about food waste, as we did the other day, is because when we waste food, it means that there's a bigger demand for food. And that means that as our population grows and continues wasting and demanding more, then you have to make more, convert more natural ecosystems into farmland, which is a source of greenhouse gases. So we have to be very careful in our farming and food production to limit the greenhouse gases from not just the foods that we grow and cultivate, but also the way that we change the land. So how much impact does food have? So this graph at the top shows you that a little bit more than a quarter of all global emissions come from our food systems. And that 74%, this other part of the graph that's just the dashed lines, is other greenhouse gas emissions. So that's like industry, fossil fuels for transportation and things like that. And then when we look at the food, the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by food, more than half of the food related emissions come from animal products. So that's raising animals, livestock for meat production, for eggs, for dairy, etc. And then if we just look at the animal products, about half of all of the farmed animal emissions come from beef and lamb. And the rest is from other animal products, so pork, chicken, fish, etc. And the reason why beef and lamb are so problematic, they produce so much greenhouse gas emissions, is twofold. They require a lot of feed, and so every time you're producing feed for animals, you're also using water, you're also releasing greenhouse gas emissions, etc. They produce a lot of manure, which produces CO2 but mostly methane. And then they also are a kind of organism that uses enteric fermentation. So they eat things that are made of cellulose, which animals can't digest. And to get access to those nutrients, they have chambers in their gut that allow bacteria and other microbes to ferment that cellulose from plant material. And then they have to get rid of the byproduct of that, which is methane. So they fart, but they mostly burp out all of this methane. And remember the image that I showed you on the first day of the cows wearing little backpacks, that's measuring their methane production. And so this is a real problem. Like we can definitely trace back a huge chunk of our greenhouse gas emissions related to food to the production of just beef and lamb. And then another problem is that as our populations become more affluent, not only do more people start eating beef, we also start eating more beef. So I went and had a hamburger the other day, and that for me is a pretty rare event. I probably do that once every couple of weeks, maybe once every couple of months, depending. And that's just a personal preference. There's no I have no agenda to not eat hamburgers. I just don't eat them very often, even though I really enjoy them. But as people, as nations become more affluent, we start to see people eating more and more beef, and so that portion of our greenhouse gas emissions from food becomes increases over year. Another way to think about the relationship between climate change and food and farming is the impacts of increasing temperatures. And what we found is that it's actually decreasing crop yields worldwide, meaning that so our sources of corn and related products, our sources of wheat, they're becoming less productive. We're seeing a global drop in yields of these staple cereals. And that's a problem because our population is growing. And so if we are farming less effectively as a result of climate change and our population is growing, then we're heading towards a real crisis when it comes to meeting the calorie needs of our growing population. The other thing that's happening is that climate change is increasing food prices. So as we see yields dropping, as we see seasonal climate extremes like heat or flooding that increases the price of food for all of us. So globally, food prices are increasing, at least in part due to the impacts of climate change. Patricia put in the chat that she'd also love to introduce, or also would introduce this portion of the GHGs by teaching supply and demand and other social studies, another social studies fundamental climate concept. Absolutely. I think climate change is so pervasive that it can be discussed or addressed in virtually every subject that you might teach. So what's going on with agriculture? So why is it having such an impact on agriculture? Well, the first thing is that excessive heat means that it's making it more difficult to grow crops outdoors and in full sun. Because of that, because of the conditions that excessive heat brings about, we're actually losing soil resources. So as fields get drier and as the crops do less well in those fields, it exposes topsoil to wind and rain. And then as that blows off, we lose natural resources in the soil as well. Droughts have a major impact. So we're in a mega drought in the Southwest, and that has had a huge impact on our farmers. We also have seen an increase in the kinds of pests and diseases that impact our farms as a result. So if it doesn't get cold enough, for example, to kill or get rid of the eggs of particular pests during the winter, then we have big populations that explode in the spring, and they, have the capacity to wipe out our crops as they do that. And then increase excessive precipitation. So most farmers will tell you that the heat is bad, a bad frost is a problem, but then so can excessive rain can be a problem too, because it prevents you from getting out into the fields and planting or maintaining your crops. It can kill crops through fungal rot and damaging roots, but can also wash them away and just is a huge problem as well. And the result of this and other impacts of climate change is that we've got, some foods that are at risk of extinction thanks to climate change. So things like bananas, chickpeas, peanuts, avocados, honey, chocolate, maple syrup. We talked about coffee and wine. Those are all at risk of extinction due to the changes that are experienced by the regions where they're farmed.